So the topic is the sources of the resurrection of Jesus reliable? And I want to look at this in 5 points, as well as bring some other surrounding evidences to make the case here, to show why we believe, at least as Muslims and other sources as well, that they're not actually reliable. So there's 5 sources, 5 points that's taken from some historical presentations. Historians note these points as things that they like to see when they're looking at historical documentation to verify whether it's reliable or not. As well as I went into the Islamic sciences to bring also a couple of sources to show the veracity of Islamic sciences in comparison to Christian sources, and use that to examine the New Testament as a reliable source for the resurrection. When one wants to examine any narration of history, there are a few key factors that historians say must be in place when trying to obtain the closest and most accurate depiction of what actually occurred, if it occurred at all. From amongst them are the following, coupled with conditions from the Islamic sciences of hadith verification, and I think that we will find is noteworthy when we conclude. The first one is contemporary eyewitnesses. Now, Mr. Burns, he concluded with this by mentioning, citing Richard Balcomb's testimony that there are eyewitness in the New Testament. When we look at contemporary eyewitness testimony, this is our position. There's not a single eyewitness testimony or a single eyewitness reliable testimony in the history of Christianity until the present day that can account for any such event of the resurrection or anything else. The crucifixion, that's just the bottom line. When we examine the gospel writers, because this first in terms of the Bible, we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, none of them are eyewitness testimony to the fact, maybe with the exception of someone may quote John, but this is contingent, and we'll look at this as we go along. Luke and Mark are not even contemporaries or disciples of Jesus, so they can never be eyewitness testimonies. But there's not a single eyewitness testimony. When I say eyewitness testimony, someone that was actual eyewitness that wrote and testified to the fact. You can tell me there were thousands of eyewitnesses, but where is their testimony to the fact? In the court of law, if you don't have the testimony from eyewitness, you have absolutely nothing. So to say they were eyewitnesses, even quoting and citing Richard Balcomb, what eyewitnesses testimony do we have in any of the books of the New Testament? The belief in the resurrection, and that's all it is a belief, is based on an inference from the belief in the crucifixion, which we'll touch on shortly. This inference comes from the ideology of Paul, because Paul is the one that said that if Jesus did not die and rise for us, then our faith is in vain. We are led astray in so many words. So this idea of the resurrection, crucifixion, and resurrection is an idea of Paul's, who's the first writer of the New Testament literature. And we believe that the following Gospels are a mirroring or reflection of this ideology that Paul proposed early on in the first century of Christianity. We continue, but as it relates to there ever being a single, reliable eyewitness testimony to the event, in any fashion, no such person has ever existed. And this is just reality. And I would challenge Mr. Burns to bring me one single eyewitness account who testified to the crucifixion or the resurrection. The existing accounts that we do find in the Bible about Jesus were not written at all by any contemporaries of Jesus or eyewitness testimonies to the fact. So not only is there not a contemporary eyewitness to the event of the resurrection, but there's not even a contemporary to give any eyewitness testimony to any event of the life of Jesus that we find as mentioned in the gospel. Another point that the historian, that's point number one. Point number two is another fact that historians like to see is multiple independent transmissions. They like to see that the account is repeated. And you have that in the New Testament. You have 4 Gospels. So these Gospels writers are writing about the same event. So you do have this. But the problem is, given the fact that there is not a single eyewitness testimony and transmission of this event, and in particular we're talking about the resurrection, then certainly there cannot be multiple independent transmissions of it. Even though you have 4 gospel writers, and you have another writer by the name of Paul who writes at his own independence and his own authority, according to his own testimony, but none of them are eyewitness testimonies to the fact. So even though there are multiple transmissions or there are multiple books on the life of Jesus, they're not written by multiple eyewitness testification. So by default, the Bible fails this point as well. Point number 3, and this will be our longest point, so I ask you your patience to bear with me, but it's very informing here. Consistency and testification of the narration, that there's not major contradictions in the stories. So let's say, for instance, the 4 gospel writers were eyewitnesses, but now we have to look at their stories and examine it. Are they consistent with each other? And if they're not consistent, then why? And this is also a theological problem, because according to Christian belief, and Jason can correct me if I'm wrong, but the Christians believe that the Gospels are inspired by God. So even though they were not eyewitness to the fact, like for instance, Mark and Luke, who were not disciples of Jesus, they were inspired by God. This adds another problem, because if they were inspired by God, then you should find no contradictions amongst the books. Yet you find major and serious contradictions amongst the 4 Gospels, and even the Acts and the books of Paul, the letters of Paul. So as for the narration of the account that we do have to examine, which are only found in the Bible, and I want to state this clearly, that when we look at, we say sources of the resurrection, the primary and really only source that Christians can rely on is the Bible itself. There's not a historical shred of evidence whatsoever coming from the 1st century up until the 21st century that anyone can say outside of the biblical text supports the resurrection. It'll be inference, it'll all be something speculation, but there's not a shred of evidence outside the New Testament. And the New Testament is what we want to examine now. So when we look into the New Testament, the Bible, we have serious and unreconcilable differences. The first of them is that the biblical texts, as we have them now, since the inception, are written in Greek, and a classical elite Greek at that. Yet the disciples of Jesus, who were eyewitness testimonies, they spoke Aramaic. Even according to the Bible, were illiterate. And this is a big problem, because when you find the first writings of the New Testament, even though we don't have the original autographs, but even if you take the first copy from those, it's still written in a high educated Greek. The disciples were not educated. They didn't speak Greek. So that means that someone else besides them had to write these accounts. According to Acts 4:13, 2 disciples, Peter and John, who John, he writes the last of the 4 Gospels, and his Gospel is the latest, coming at the end of the 1st century. Even some say the 2nd century, begin 2nd century. He's considered to be illiterate. So an illiterate man writing 70 years, 60, 70 years after the fact about the life of Jesus, and his gospel is considered to be non-synoptic because it contradicts in many ways the other 3. And he's an illiterate man, and he's writing in a classical type of Greek. This is a problem because it's not consistent. It doesn't meet, you know what I'm saying, it doesn't meet the standards of historicity in terms of evaluating sources. Also, internal evidence make this point clear as well by the way of several contradictions. So when we examine the stories of the New Testament and we find all of these contradictions, it undermines the authenticity and reliability of these documents as we have them. For instance, what day was Jesus crucified? This is important because, again, if this is inspired by God, then this should be something that should be accurate and no contradiction. If it wasn't inspired by God, then it's a historical problem. So no matter how you look at it, as an inspiration or as history, it's a problem. Who carried the cross? Was it Simon or was it Jesus? This is a problem, historically as well as inspiration-wise. Who went to the tomb? Who were seen at the tomb? Did Jesus and the disciples ever leave Jerusalem, or did they stay? These are clear problems that we have in the New Testament writings that are serious contradictions that undermines, first and foremost, its historicity or its historical reliability, as well as its idea or claim of inspiration. And inspiration is a bigger problem because now you're placing the mistake on God. And we say, "A'udhu billahi min dhalik." We seek God's protection from that. All of these are contradictions. These contradictions are serious enough to render the narrations of the accounts unreliable. Now, I have a few questions on this fact, or this point number 3. Why was Jesus, and this is something for us to think about when we look at the intertextual analysis of the resurrection story. I want us to think about, even if we take this on face value, that their sources has been protected, and it goes back to the time of Jesus. When we actually read the story itself, there are many things that stands out that just doesn't make sense to us that would give credence to the story itself. Rather, they undermine the story, and this is important. So I have 5 quick questions that I want to examine, and then we move on. One is, why was Jesus disguised as a gardener supposedly after the alleged resurrection? If Jesus had died and he had rose again, why was he disguised as a gardener according to John 20:15, and Mary Magdalene thought he was a gardener? This is something that we have to answer to, because it would make no sense for Mary, someone who knew Jesus very well, and who some people call her the beloved servant, the beloved companion of Jesus. Some list her as that. Why would she not recognize him and think he was a gardener? Question number 2, why then the disciples of Jesus recognize him and believe in him? We read in Luke chapter 24:11, Peter says the idea when Mary came back after telling them that Jesus had resurrected or Jesus was gone, he was in the tomb, he said, "This is fables, this is nonsense." Now, this undermines the idea, and the idea that Jesus prophesied his death and resurrection. If Jesus prophesied his death and resurrection, why would the disciples say the idea of him being resurrected be nonsense? So this undermines that idea, and many scholars also don't believe that Jesus prophesied his death and resurrection. And Paul says, according to the scripture, that he would die and be raised up again 3 days. And after 3 days, according to the scripture, there's nowhere in any scripture that says that. So Paul is quoting scripture, but what scripture is he quoting to support his claim? We don't find it nowhere in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Number 3, why did Jesus seem so hungry? When we look at his life, we find Jesus, he ate, he broke bread, and then again he appears to his disciples after being with them for a half a day. They didn't recognize him, and then when he met them, he asked them, "Do you have anything to eat?" The point here, this is a theological problem for us. If you're saying that Jesus conquered death and he's resurrected and he's no more dependent upon his physical body, why is he continually eating and asking for food and obviously appearing to be hungry? These are things just to think about. When we look at this story, we just can't take it on face value anymore. We have to examine these things, and looking at these things logically is part of the examination. Question number 4, why did Jesus refuse to leave Jerusalem and also command the disciples the same? As we find in Acts 1:4, Luke 24:49-43, he says, "Stay here in Jerusalem and don't go outside this area." So why is that? The contention is that because he's still evading the people who tried to kill him, he don't want to make himself broadcasted to people, so he's staying low key, as we say. And this was understood from these kind of events. He's disguised, he's not being recognized, he's appearing and not appearing. He's saying, "Don't go over here." And then the 5th question to complement all of this is, why didn't Jesus just appear to Pilate and those who ordered him to be killed from amongst the Jews to prove that he truly conquered death and was who he said he was? If Jesus had truly conquered death and resurrected and know that he cannot be killed anymore because he's a resurrected body, why not appear to all of these people, and why not have his appearance recorded by eyewitnesses en masse? Paul is the only one that says he appeared to more people, like over 500, but where from amongst those 500 is any eyewitness testification to that fact? We have absolutely none. Absolutely none, other than what the Gospels provide for us. And like we mentioned, we believe the Gospel writings are mirroring or portraying of the theology that Paul proposed early on, since his writings was the first. So this is point number 3. And we have 5 questions there. We move quickly to point number 4, which is authenticated complete chain transmission. And these last 2 points are taken from the Islamic sciences, and we move them very quickly so we can get to some points to mention in closing. But an authenticated complete chain of transmission means that if you have a testification from someone, they can relate who they got it from and relate who they got it from back to its original source to verify that this source is its veracity meets standards. If I say something now that something happened, how can you verify it happened unless you could trace it back to someone? Similarly, like we have our family tree. How can you claim to be from this descendants or have this people in your genealogy if you can't trace your family tree? We can't believe the Bible on face value because the Bible, or people say you should believe in the Bible. I want to have something substantial and concrete in order for me to base my belief on it. And when we look and examine the New Testament, we just don't have that. That's the reality of the matter. And then the 5th point is verification of the people that we do have in the chain. So when we look at those people that actually exist in this narration, we can look at their character, we can look at their acumen, we can look at things about them and say, you know something, this person is reliable, he said this from this person, and on like that. We have none of this whatsoever as it comes to New Testament literature and history. And if one makes a claim that, well, this wasn't the way of the people of old, this is just not accurate, because the people of old were very particular about citing their sources. For instance, we have in an article that was written by a gentleman by the name of Matthew Ferguson. He has a very nice article, and he mentions 10 points as it relates to history and verifying sources. But I only dealt with 5 that I got from other sources and from the Islamic sciences. But he mentions ancient historical works at the beginning or someone else within the body of the narrative are often prefaced with statements from the author about the period they will be investigating, the methodology they will be using, and the types of sources they will be discussing. None of the Gospels, with the exception of a very brief statement at the beginning of Luke, even come close to following this convention. And this is pre-Jesus time. This is 3rd, 2nd, 1st century before Jesus and afterwards. So we can't say it didn't exist because it's clear it did exist. This was the style of those who wrote history. And we have a list of historical writers that done such and follow such standards. But he says none of the Gospels, with the exception of a very brief statement at the beginning of Luke, even come close to following this convention. Furthermore, the opening of Luke is hardly substantial enough to consider it of the same caliber as actual historical prose. As scholar Marion Swords, and he notes this from the Oxford Annotated Bible, page 1027, he notes the initial 4 verses of the book are a single Greek sentence that forms a highly stylized introductory statement typical of ancient historical writings. After this distinctive preface, however, the narrative shifts into a style of Greek reminiscent of the Septuagint. As such, while Luke mimics some of the conventions of historical writing at the beginning of the gospel, the rest of the narrative reverts into storytelling typical of other gospels. So this is basically the conclusion that they make. The Gospels in the New Testament basically boils down to being on the same par as a novel, because it has nothing that we can really use to validate its historical sources and use to prove that. I think my time is coming to a close.
You've got 1 minute. You've got 1 minute remaining.
1 minute. I want to cite some other things, but quickly. Jason, he cited Paul about the gospel and preaching another gospel. I want us to keep this in mind as we go out through this debate, because it's interesting that Paul is contending with other people about his view of Jesus. Paul never knew Jesus. He was very ignorant of Jesus. It is many things that he never quote or talks about Jesus. I mean, for instance, Paul never talks about the life of Jesus. He don't cite spiritual resurrection, nor does he, he cites only as spiritual. He doesn't cite the empty tomb. He doesn't cite the virgin birth. There's many things in the life of Jesus that Paul leaves out. Why? Because of his ignorance of Jesus. Yet, over 50% of the New Testament is written by Paul. The major theology of the New Testament is written by Paul. The whole doctrine of crucifixion and resurrection for salvation is introduced by Paul. Yet, this individual, Paul, is not a reliable source for us to depend upon. And because of that, we have to conclude that the sources of the New Testament or the resurrection is not reliable.